The airport buzzed with life. Los Angeles International Airport, LAX, a chaotic hub of families dragging luggage, business travelers glued to their phones, and impatient children darting through crowds. Flight announcements droned overhead, barely cutting through the murmur of conversations and rolling suitcases. Through the glass doors, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hayes stepped inside, his polished black shoes clicking against the tile floor. At 46, he carried himself with the kind of discipline that came from decades in uniform. His army dress blues were immaculate, ribbons and medals displayed in precise alignment over his chest. His hat sat perfectly on his head, and his posture remained unwavering, despite the heavy weight pressing on his shoulders. This wasn't his first time in an airport, not even close. But today was different. Today, he wasn't just a soldier in transit. He was a guardian of the fallen. Stationed on the tarmac, waiting in the cargo hold of a military transport, lay a flag-draped casket. The remains of Sergeant Anthony Williams, a 24-year-old soldier who had paid the ultimate price for his country. Too young, too soon. Hayes inhaled deeply, adjusting his hat with a firm grip. This mission wasn't about him, it was about a promise. No soldier gets left behind. He made his way toward the airline check-in counter, stepping past exhausted travelers who barely noticed him. That was something he'd grown used to over the years. Most Americans didn't really see their soldiers until they were gone. Approaching the counter, Hayes pulled out his military orders and government-issued ID, placing them neatly in front of the airline agent. The woman behind the desk barely looked up at first, typing into her computer with the kind of mechanical efficiency that came from repeating the same process 1,000 times a day. But then, as her eyes flicked to the documents, something shifted. A brief hesitation, a sideways glance at her co-worker, a subtle tension in her posture. Hayes had seen this kind of body language before, in combat zones, in foreign negotiations, in places where things suddenly turned hostile without warning. The woman cleared her throat, forcing a stiff smile. "Sir, can I see that again?" Her voice was polite, but something was off. Hayes kept his expression neutral as he slid the papers forward once more. She studied them, then whispered something to the co-worker next to her. He glanced over, frowned, then quickly looked away. A moment stretched too long. Then she turned back, her expression strangely tight. "I'm sorry, sir, but there's an issue with your ticket." The measured pause. "You won't be able to board this flight." The words hit like a punch, but Hayes didn't react. He had been in far worse situations than this. His voice remained steady. "I'm escorting the remains of a fallen soldier." He tapped the paperwork, holding her gaze. "Everything is in order." The agent shifted uncomfortably, but didn't meet his eyes. "I understand, sir, but it's policy." A cold, bureaucratic phrase, designed to shut down conversations. Behind him, the crowd of passengers kept moving, oblivious. But for Marcus Hayes, the world had just stopped. This wasn't about a ticket. This was something else. And he wasn't going anywhere without an answer. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hayes stood firm, his gaze steady on the airline agent. The words still hung in the air. "You won't be able to board this flight." A civilian might have panicked, demanded answers, or raised their voice. But Hayes had been through worse. Combat zones, political standoffs, moments where patience determined survival. He took a slow breath, keeping his voice measured. "Ma'am, I am escorting the remains of Sergeant Anthony Williams. My orders are clear and my paperwork is in order. I need you to clarify exactly what the issue is." The agent, Rachel, shifted uncomfortably. Her fingers tapped at the keyboard, though it was clear she wasn't actually inputting anything useful. The brief hesitation, the sideways glance at her co-worker. Hayes noticed everything. Behind him, the airport continued its usual chaotic rhythm. Parents corralled their children, Business travelers scrolled mindlessly on their phones, airline announcements droned overhead. But within the space around the counter, a different kind of tension was forming. Rachel cleared her throat, forcing a stiff, professional smile. "It's just a security protocol, sir." There it was. Vague, evasive, deliberate. Hayes didn't move. Didn't blink. What protocol? Rachel faltered. Her co-worker, a man with greying hair and a name tag that read Dawson, stepped forward, adopting a neutral tone. The kind of calculated corporate politeness used to de-escalate complaints. "Colonel, we understand this is important. However, our system flagged your ticket due to security concerns. It's out of our hands." Security concerns. The word settled in Hayes's gut like a weight. A man in full military dress. An officer with decades of service. An escort for a fallen soldier. And he was the security concerned. A flicker of movement caught his attention. A few people in line had stopped watching their phones and started watching him. A woman in a red blazer whispered something to her husband. A younger man in a hoodie frowned, glancing between Hayes and the airline staff. This wasn't just a routine delay. It was something more calculated. Hayes kept his tone even. "Are you telling me that I, a U.S. Army officer on official military duty, am being denied boarding because of an unspecified security concern?" Dawson exhaled, his hands clasped in front of him. He wasn't answering, because there was no real answer. A murmur ran through the growing crowd. Someone pulled out a phone. Hayes heard the soft chime of a camera recording. Rachel's forced smile wavered. Dawson shifted his weight, suddenly aware that they had an audience. Then a new voice cut through the moment, sharp and unwavering. "Sir, do you have an issue with his military clearance?" The crowd turned. The speaker was an older man, mid-60s, his face weathered, a well-worn USMC cap on his head. A Marine. A veteran. Dawson hesitated, then shook his head. "No, sir, this isn't about clearance." The Marine folded his arms, his voice carrying weight. "Then what is it?" The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. More phones appeared. The shift was happening. This wasn't just a denied flight anymore. It was a moment. And Hayes knew exactly what that meant. A ripple of tension spread through the terminal. The air around the check-in counter felt heavier now, charged with something unspoken but undeniable. The Marine veteran who had called out wasn't backing down. And neither was Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hayes. Dawson, the airline supervisor, shifted on his feet, his jaw tightening as the weight of the moment settled on him. He looked past Hayes, scanning the growing crowd. People were no longer just waiting in line. They were watching. Some were whispering, others pulling out their phones. A few were already recording. Hayes could sense it. The shift. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was turning into something bigger. He turned back to Dawson, keeping his voice measured, steady. "Sir, I need a clear reason why I am being denied boarding. If there is an actual security protocol preventing me from escorting a fallen soldier, I want to see it in writing." Rachel, the airline agent, lowered her eyes to her screen, pretending to be busy, but Hayes could see her fingers. They weren't typing anything at all. Dawson cleared his throat, adopting a tone of forced authority, but Hayes wasn't fooled. "Colonel, we are simply following procedure. This is not personal." A sharp scoff came from behind him. "Yeah? Sure doesn't look that way." Hayes turned his head slightly. A man in his 30s, wearing a red hoodie and holding his phone up, had spoken. He wasn't alone. Several others were watching closely, their expressions shifting from confusion to something else. Outrage. The Marine veteran stepped forward, his voice carrying through the terminal. "I served 2 tours in Iraq. I've been through airport security 1,000 times. I have never, not once, seen a policy stop a soldier from bringing a fallen brother home. So tell me, What is this really about? The murmurs grew louder. A middle-aged woman in a denim jacket whispered to her husband, shaking her head. Another passenger, a young man with a backpack slung over one shoulder, frowned at the airline staff. Then a woman, no older than 25, took a step closer, holding her phone up. Her voice was careful, deliberate. "I just want to make sure I understand this correctly." She looked at Hayes, then back at Dawson. "You're saying that an active duty army officer on official orders is being blocked from escorting a fallen soldier home. Am I getting that right?" Her words cut through the air. Dawson inhaled sharply, glancing around. He knew what was happening. This was spiraling out of his control. Case stayed silent, watching. He had seen this before, in briefings, in press conferences, in moments when someone realized they had made the wrong move and there was no turning back. Then, from somewhere in the back of the crowd, a voice muttered, "It's already trending." And just like that, the airline had a much bigger problem than Marcus Hayes. The shift was undeniable now. What had started as a quiet altercation at the check-in counter had turned into something much bigger. A story, a spectacle, a controversy. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hayes didn't move, didn't flinch. He had spent decades in the army learning the value of patience, of strategy, of knowing when to let the situation escalate on its own. And right now, the situation was unfolding exactly as it should. The crowd was no longer just murmuring. It was reacting. A man in a red hoodie kept his phone raised, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous. He's literally escorting a fallen soldier and they're treating him like this?" The young woman who had spoken earlier was still recording, her face set with quiet determination. "People need to see this," she said, half to herself, half to the growing number of passengers tuning in around her. Somewhere near the back of the line, a man exhaled sharply, shaking his head as he stared at his screen. "It's already trending," he muttered. Dawson, the airline supervisor, heard it too, his jaw clenched. Rachel, the check-in agent, suddenly looked very interested in her computer screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. But it was too late for damage control. Passengers were watching, recording, tweeting. Then the first real crack in the airline's control over the situation appeared. A woman in a denim jacket clutching her purse turned to her husband. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It's on Facebook." The Marine veteran took another step forward, arms still folded, his eyes locked on Dawson. "You see what's happening here?" His voice was low but carried weight. "People aren't gonna let this slide." Dawson's eyes flicked between Hayes, the recording phones, the passengers who were no longer just bystanders but participants. Then, from the far side of the terminal, a new voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, sir." A young airport employee in a security uniform stepped up to Dawson, holding out a phone. His face was tight, his eyes uneasy. "I think you should see this." Dawson snatched the phone, scrolling quickly. His face paled. The red-hooded man smirked. "What's wrong? Not looking good for you guys?" Hayes stood still, watching. He knew exactly what Dawson was seeing. A major news outlet had just picked up the story. The headline was blunt, direct. "U.S. Army Colonel denied flight while escorting fallen soldier. Airline scrambles for answers." Underneath, a video clip was already playing. Footage from inside the terminal. Dawson exhaled sharply. He handed the phone back, his shoulders stiff. And just like that, the airline had lost control of the narrative. Dawson's grip on the phone tightened before he shoved it back into the security officer's hand. His face was pale, his jaw clenched. The growing noise of the terminal suddenly seemed deafening. Phones still recording, whispers turning into hushed outrage, the pressure mounting by the second. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hayes didn't move. He had no reason to. The weight of the moment wasn't on him. It was on the airline, on Dawson, on the people who had turned a routine military escort into a national disgrace. Then, through the shifting crowd, a man in a tailored navy blue suit emerged. His posture was controlled, his movements brisk. Unlike Dawson, who was already wilting under the pressure, this man carried himself with the presence of someone who had been summoned to put out fires before. His airline badge read Michael Langston, Regional Director. He scanned the scene quickly. Hayes in uniform, Dawson looking desperate, the Marine veteran standing firm, the endless sea of phones capturing every second. Langston cleared his throat, straightening his tie before stepping up to Hayes. His voice was smooth, too polished, too rehearsed. "Colonel, I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding. There was a system error. We are correcting it immediately." Hayes let the words hang in the air. He had heard that tone before. In boardrooms, in political briefings, in places where people weren't actually sorry, just sorry they got caught. Langston offered a thin, diplomatic smile. "First-class accommodations, of course." A murmur ran through the crowd. The Marine veteran scoffed. "That's not the point." Hayes stayed silent, watching Langston squirm under the weight of a situation he no longer controlled. Then, in a measured voice, he finally spoke. "Let me ask you something, Mr. Langston." Hayes' eyes locked onto the man's. "If no one recorded this, if no one spoke up, would I still be standing here?" Silence. Langston swallowed, hesitated. He knew the answer. Everyone in the terminal knew the answer. The weight of that truth settled over the room. A woman in the crowd murmured under her breath, "He's right." Langston tried again. "Sir, we sincerely apologize." "We both know this isn't about an apology," Hayes interrupted. "It's about accountability." The crowd murmured in agreement. Langston's mask of control cracked, just a little. Before he could speak again, the security officer's radio crackled. A voice came through, urgent, clipped. "Get someone from corporate down here, now." Langston's eyes darted to Dawson, then back to Hayes. This wasn't just a PR problem anymore. It was a disaster. The terminal had gone eerily silent. The usual airport chaos, the rolling luggage, the distant boarding calls, the chatter of impatient travelers, had faded into the background. All eyes were on the confrontation. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hayes remained still, his presence unwavering. The airline had fumbled every step of this situation, and now, with cameras recording and the internet already running with the story, they were scrambling for control. But it was too late for damage control. Dawson was tense, shifting nervously. Langston's mask of corporate composure was cracking. The airline was cornered, and they knew it. Then, from the far end of the terminal, a new figure entered the scene. He wasn't from the airline. He wasn't airport security. He was military. The moment he stepped forward, the atmosphere shifted. The crisp army dress uniform, the calculated, authoritative stride, Hayes recognized it immediately. This wasn't just another officer. This was someone with real power. The name tag read, Major Daniel Ross. He walked with purpose, a commanding presence that parted the crowd as he approached. When he reached Hayes, he extended a firm handshake. "Colonel," he said, his voice steady, "I'm Major Ross, Department of the Army. We've been informed of the situation." The tension in the air sharpened. Langston's confident stance faltered. Dawson's face drained of color. The Army was here. Hayes met Ross's handshake, his grip strong and unwavering. Ross turned to Langston, his tone shifting, no longer diplomatic, no longer patient. "Colonel Hayes and the remains of Sergeant Williams will not be flying commercial." Langston's mouth opened, but Ross didn't give him the chance to speak. "A military transport is waiting." Effective immediately. The crowd reacted, a ripple of murmurs, a shift in energy. This wasn't just about a flight anymore. This was the military stepping in, because the airline had failed. Langston swallowed hard. "Major, I assure you, this was all a misunderstanding." Ross's eyes were sharp. "Then I assume the airline will have no problem addressing this with the Pentagon?" Langston's jaw tightened. He knew what that meant. This wasn't going away. The Marine veteran in the crowd gave a satisfied grunt. The man in the red hoodie smirked. The young woman holding her phone up didn't stop recording. This moment wasn't just about Marcus Hayes anymore. It was about what had just been exposed. Ross nodded toward Hayes. "Let's go, Colonel. It's time to finish this mission." Without another glance at the airline staff, Hayes adjusted his hat, squared his shoulders, and walked away. The airline had lost. But the consequences? They were just beginning. The moment Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hayes and Major Daniel Ross walked away, the spell over the terminal broke. Passengers started murmuring, some shaking their heads, others still filming as the tension settled into something different. Outrage, disbelief, and, for some, vindication. But for the airline, the real storm was just beginning. Within hours, major news outlets had picked up the story. The viral video of Hayes standing firm while airline staff fumbled for excuses spread like wildfire. Military advocacy groups issued official statements condemning the airline's treatment of a service member escorting a fallen soldier. Then came the political response. Several high-profile politicians weighed in, demanding accountability. A senator, himself a veteran, called it a national embarrassment. A congressional committee hinted at an investigation into systemic discrimination in airline policies. By the next morning, the airline's stock price had dropped. Social media exploded. The hashtag #LetHimFly trended across platforms. Customers flooded the airline's accounts with demands for an explanation, for action, for justice. The airline's damage control machine kicked into high gear. The CEO appeared on national television, his expression carefully controlled as he delivered a public apology. "We deeply regret this unfortunate misunderstanding and are committed to reviewing our policies to ensure this never happens again." Too little, too late. The backlash wasn't stopping. Veterans organizations announced a formal complaint against the airline. A lawsuit followed, alleging discrimination and failure to uphold military service protections. Meanwhile, Marcus Hayes wasn't thinking about any of it. He stood at attention as Sergeant Anthony Williams' casket was lowered onto the tarmac in Texas. The family stood nearby, eyes red-rimmed but full of pride. This moment wasn't about viral videos or corporate fallout. It was about honor, duty, respect. Hayes saluted as William's mother placed a trembling hand on the flag-draped casket. This was why he stood his ground, not for himself, but for the promise that no soldier would be left behind. The airline could try to rebuild its reputation, but the world had seen the truth. And some things, once exposed, cannot be ignored. This story is more than just a viral controversy. It's a wake-up call. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hayes didn't seek attention. He wasn't trying to make a statement. He was simply fulfilling his duty. But when a system designed to respect and honor those who serve failed him, it wasn't just about one denied flight. It was about accountability, respect, and standing up for what is right. This situation exposed a deeper issue. If it hadn't been for the people who spoke up, the Marine veteran, the passengers, the ones who pulled out their phones and refused to let it slide, would the airline have ever corrected its mistake? The answer is clear, no. And that's the lesson here. Silence allows injustice to continue, but when people stand together, when voices are raised, when the truth is exposed, change becomes inevitable. What can we take away from this? Respect shouldn't require a viral video. It should be the standard. Companies only take responsibility when they're forced to. Public accountability matters. One voice can spark a movement. A single person standing up can inspire others to follow. Social media is a powerful tool. When used for the right reasons, it shines a light on issues that would otherwise be ignored. Now, it's your turn. What do you think about this story? Have you ever witnessed or experienced something similar? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story resonated with you, hit the like button, share this video, and subscribe for more real-life stories that challenge, inspire, and expose the truth. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Your voice matters. Keep standing up, keep speaking out, because when we hold those in power accountable, we create a world that truly honors justice.